In 1630, Boston was not yet Boston in the full, familiar sense. It was Shawmut, a narrow peninsula of wind, marsh, and hill attached to the mainland by a thin neck of land and surrounded by cold Atlantic water. 3 hills rose from it, uneven and exposed, watching over a harbour scattered with islands and tidal flats. To English settlers arriving from across the ocean, it looked like possibility. To the indigenous people who already knew this coast, it was part of an older world, used, travelled, remembered, and understood long before English maps or English prayers reached these shores. And that is where the real story begins, not with emptiness, but with encounter. The Massachusetts Bay region had long been home to the Massachusetts people who knew where fish ran, where shellfish could be gathered, where fresh water lay hidden, and how the seasons turned this coastline from abundance to danger and back again. The English, however, came carrying something different. They brought livestock, tools, Bibles, legal charters, and an idea of society so strong that it crossed the Atlantic with them. These were not just migrants in search of land. Many were Puritans, English Protestants, who believed the Church of England
Gloria
remained too
Patri et
corrupt,
Filio et
too
Spiritus
ceremonial,
Sancto.
too compromised. In New
We'll build the
England,
mill
they
here,
hoped to
by the
build not
river.
merely houses,
Mark
but a
that spot,
purified
Master Thor.
community,
It is noted.
a place ordered by discipline,
The eyes of all
scripture,
people are
and
upon
collective
us. We
purpose.
must uphold our
That
covenant,
purpose
for we are
landed
as a
first in
city upon a
hardship.
hill. The Lord shall not
When the
fail us.
Winthrop fleet arrived in 1630, hundreds of settlers came ashore exhausted from the crossing. Ships rocked in the harbour, while families disembarked stiff, hungry, and uncertain. At first, many settled in Charlestown, across the water. On paper, it seemed promising. In reality, it became quickly clear that survival there would be far more difficult than their hopes had imagined. Fresh water was scarce, food was limited, heat,
How fares thee,
sickness,
husband?
and poor shelter
Drink a little
began to wear
broth.
people down almost immediately. The Atlantic crossing was over, but the true test had only just begun. So the settlers looked again, this time across the water to Shawmut. There, one detail changed everything: a reliable spring. It had been identified by William Blackstone, an Anglican clergyman living there in relative isolation, a man not truly aligned with the Puritan project, yet essential to its success. It is one of those quiet ironies history loves. The future heart of Puritan Boston began to gather around the advice of someone outside their strict religious circle. But cities often begin this way, not through grand declarations, but through practical necessity. A spring, fresh water, the one thing no sermon can replace. And once the decision was made, the building began. At first, Boston was not brick and steeples, not broad streets or permanence. It was timber, mud, smoke, rope, and labour. Men felled trees, squared beams, and lifted rough frames into place. Women unpacked tools and bedding, cooked what food remained, cared for children, patched clothing, and tried to create a rhythm of home in a place still half camp, half settlement. Children carried wood, hauled water, and learned early that survival here depended on work. The ground was uneven, the shoreline was wet and shifting. Salt air pushed into everything. Nothing about the place made construction easy. And yet what rose here was more than shelter. It was a physical expression of belief. The meeting house mattered as much as any house, perhaps more. In Puritan New England, the town itself was a moral design. A settlement was not simply where people lived, it was where they were meant to be watched, corrected, guided, and joined in covenant. The placement of homes, the common spaces, the visibility of neighbours, the centrality of worship, none of it was accidental. Boston was being built as a community where the shape of daily life would reinforce the shape of faith. Still, beneath that determination was a reality much darker. than the settlers' own narratives often admitted. The land on which Boston began to rise had recently been transformed by epidemic disease, likely introduced through earlier European contact. Coastal indigenous communities had suffered catastrophic losses before the large Puritan migration even arrived. Some English settlers interpreted this devastation as providence, believing God had cleared a place for them. But what they were truly entering was not an empty world. It was a wounded one. The silence they encountered in some places was not natural emptiness. It was the echo of catastrophe. That shadow lingered over the town from the start, even if many refused to see it clearly. At the center of this unfolding project stood John Winthrop, one of the defining figures of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Lawyer, magistrate, governor, organizer, he helped shape not only the politics of the settlement, but its moral imagination. During the voyage, he delivered the ideas later remembered, in connection with the phrase, "a city upon a hill." Today, those words are often quoted with triumph, but in their original spirit, they carried warning as much as confidence. Winthrop believed this community would be watched. If it failed in righteousness, the world would see. If it succeeded, it might stand as an example. And yet the town being assembled on Shawmut already carried contradiction inside it. These settlers had crossed the ocean seeking freedom from religious pressure, but they were not building a society of open tolerance. They wanted liberty for their own form of worship, not equal room for every belief. Their vision was sincere, disciplined, and often courageous, but it could also be narrow, rigid, and suspicious of dissent. That tension was present from the beginning, in the very grain of the place. A carpenter could be raising a wall, while a magistrate discussed order. A minister studied scripture, and a family worried over food stores. The town was being built, from labor and conviction at once. But conviction, when hardened, can become its own kind of confinement. And while governors and ministers shaped the colony from above, ordinary life was shaping it from below. The shoreline was busy almost immediately. Small boats crossed between settlements, fish were split, cleaned and salted. Barrels were rolled into storage, nets were dried, rope was coiled on damp wharves. Even in infancy, Boston was already oriented toward the harbor. The sea was not just scenery, it was food, trade, communication, and risk all at once. Through it came connection to Salem, to Plymouth, to England, and to the wider Atlantic world. The same water that isolated Boston would also make it powerful. Further inland, daily life took form in practical fragments. A woman bent over a steaming pot while smoke crawled through a crude chimney. A man sharpened an axe beside stacked logs. Someone mended sailcloth. Someone else counted meal or dried corn, calculating how long the household might last. A child sickened. A fence collapsed. A patch of ground was cleared for planting. A cow broke loose. These are not the details monuments preserve, but they are the details from which a town is actually made. And almost immediately, so was paperwork. One of the least dramatic but most revealing truths about early Boston is how quickly record keeping appeared. Before there was beauty, there were lists. Before there was comfort, there were land grants, church rolls, rules, boundaries, and formal allocations. Ownership had to be marked, membership had to be tracked, conduct had to be regulated. The settlement was not just timber and mud, it was administration beginning to harden into structure. That habit, this urge to document, define, and govern, would remain one of Boston's enduring traits. Yet, for all that seriousness, fear was everywhere. Fear of winter, fear of crop failure, fear of hunger, fear of illness, fear of attack, fear that suffering might be a sign of divine displeasure. In Puritan thought, material hardship and spiritual meaning were never fully separate. A storm was weather, but it might also be judgment. A death was grief, but it might also be a warning. This gave the early settlement a peculiar intensity. Every event could feel like a test. Every season could feel as though it carried a message from heaven. And still, life persisted in becoming ordinary. Children ran between houses, bread baked, fish dried in the wind, gardens were planted, neighbours exchanged tools. Someone laughed. Someone rested for a moment in the harbour light. This is another truth that often gets lost in grand history. Even in harsh beginnings, routine insists on forming itself. People do not live forever in the mood of founding. Sooner or later, they begin cooking, arguing, mending, trading, and enduring. That is when a settlement starts becoming a town. The new town was named Boston, after the town in Lincolnshire, England, a place tied to several of the leading colonists. The naming was more than nostalgia. It was an act of transfer, as though memory itself could be carried across the ocean and fastened onto this new ground. Old England was being echoed in New England, but the echo was never exact. The climate was different. The coastline was different. The indigenous presence was different. The ambitions were different. Even the hardships were shaping the settlers into something their old world had not prepared them to be.
We are thankful for your
From
safe
there,
arrival.
the town grew quickly. The harbour helped. So did leadership, migration, and the colony's administrative seriousness. Within a few decades, Boston would become one of the most important towns in English North America, a centre of religion, politics, trade, and argument. But in 1630, none of that was yet guaranteed. The future city existed only in rough outlines, timber frames, muddy paths, a spring on Shawmut, and a people determined to make permanence out of uncertainty. Modern Boston is, in some ways, almost unrecognizable from that first settlement. The narrow peninsula was transformed over time. Hills were cut down, shorelines were filled. The neck that once linked the town to the mainland disappeared into urban expansion. Neighbourhoods now stand on ground that did not exist when the first settlers arrived. The geography itself was altered by human ambition. That feels fitting because Boston began as a place where vision was always pushing against terrain, reshaping it, forcing it toward a desired form. And yet the earlier city is still there, beneath the later one. It remains in the harbour's pull, in the old street patterns, in burial grounds, in names, in the memory of Beacon Hill, in the city's habit of taking itself seriously. It remains in the tension between moral idealism and exclusion, between public purpose and private hardship, between vision and contradiction. Boston has long seemed aware that it stands under scrutiny by history, by politics, by itself. That feeling reaches all the way back to 1630. So when we imagine how Boston began to be built, we should not picture a clean founding tableau with flags, certainty, and orderly progress. We should picture mud on boots, salt wind in faces, sick settlers searching for water, indigenous ground marked by recent devastation, timber lifted by hand, a meeting house rising before comfort, lists being written before streets were finished, a town assembled from fear, faith, exhaustion, and resolve. And that is what makes the beginning feel so close even now. Because Boston did not begin as a finished idea. It began as an argument with landscape, with belief, with survival itself. It began with people trying to build a righteous world while carrying human limits into every beam they raised. It began on contested land, under a hard sky, at the edge of an ocean that had already changed them. And in that fragile, unfinished beginning, the later city is already visible, ambitious, disciplined, restless, self-conscious, powerful, and never entirely free of the contradictions in its foundation. Boston was not born as a monument. It was built, board, by people who did not yet know whether they would survive long enough to see it endure.